you're giving this at a bigger conference, right?
What's that?
You're going to be giving this at a bigger conference.
That's the hope. That's the hope.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm submitting it for a bigger conference. So it'll grow into a bigger talk.
Right.
So you guys can maybe help me do that. That'd be great. So my talk's name is the Architectural Cleanse. So do you ever look at your code and you're confused? You ever try to reuse some part of the software or the code, but it's so tightly coupled to some other part of the software? It can be very frustrating. Maybe so frustrating that you want to destroy your computer, or maybe even eat it. If you're like them, or you need some help, well, I have a solution for you. Act now, and you can enjoy the architectural cleanse. You can make your project look good on the outside and feel good when you work on it from the inside. For only $19.95, unless you live in Quebec for some reason, then you cannot. It's not that cheap. So, in all seriousness, I saw some talks on a clean architecture, and I also listened to some podcasts that were walking through the book Clean Architecture. And so, after hearing about these ideas, I wanted to experiment with one of the products I work on to make it have a cleaner architecture. And so, what is a clean architecture, and what is the architectural cleanse? What is it about? So it starts out with kind of a correction of what most people think about when you ask them. So if you ask somebody, hey, what's your architecture for this product? Oftentimes they'll answer you with something like this. Oh, we're Java, Eclipse, Springcat, Tomcat, Hibernate, MySQL, MVC, or Node, JS, Angular, C#. They list off a bunch of tools and frameworks and things. But unfortunately, at least according to a clean architecture perspective, a list of tools is not an architecture. That's just a list of tools. A list of tools isn't the house, right, or the design of the house. So good architectures scream their intended usage. So if you look at an architecture diagram for a library, you start looking at it and you see like, oh, okay, there's a lot of shelves, there's some areas to sit and read, there's some conference rooms to talk about what you're reading. So you can see real clearly the intended usage is to store and retrieve books, and then also read and use the books and research and that kind of thing. So the architecture of a building screams its intended usage if the architect's doing a good job. And so it should be the same way with software, but unfortunately when we look at a lot of our code projects, you open it up and you see controllers, helpers, models, utils, views, config, database. What's screaming out at you are the the delivery mechanisms, the UI, the persistence layer, the tools. Those are what you see, and it's hiding the use cases and kind of the domain of the system. So in many ways, a clean architecture is having a more domain-oriented design for your system. And in many ways, it's by separating the domain, the business logic, the use cases. For yours was real estate, right? Yeah. So if you're talking about real estate, that's the domain, right? Okay. The non-domain things are all the tech, right? The user interface, the database, Amazon, the cloud, MVC, UI patterns, HTTP protocols, persistence. So the whole idea of this is to separate the two things so that they're independent, and then make the domain key in front and center. So I'm sitting there watching this infomercial, so to speak, 1 a.m. What's the only rational response? I acted now. I had to, I needed to capitalize on this. But in all seriousness, one of my projects, I was like, I'm going to try this out. I kind of see what he's talking about. I want to see what this feels like when I try it out. So I want to run an experiment. So I ran this architectural cleanse experiment on one of my products. So the product is a logic tutorial software that I kind of worked on the side and is in use at a university classroom that helps students learn logic. So they're walking through their homework, and instead of being on pen and paper and not really having any feedback until they turn it in, it's giving you feedback as you go. On question 1, you gave this answer, and it'll give you back, well, you got this part right, but this part wrong, and it'll draw a little picture of it. So this is in use at Southern Evangelical Seminary right now. And so the domain is things like logic analysis, proposition, argument, term, the kind of the domain of it. The tech stack of this app, at least it started out as kind of a Windows MVVM pattern with XAML and C#, and it kind of grew and it transpiles now into JavaScript, HTML5, so it can run cross-platform. It has a persistence layer for storing things, and that's its tech stack. So before doing this cleanse, I opened up the solution the kind of project explorer. And what did I see front and center? I see console, I see HTML5, I see WPF, which is like the Windows, one of the Windows implementations for front ends. It's kind of cutting it off there a little bit. So I'm like, okay, that's not great. Front and center is not the domain, it's the tools. Well, how about if I dig deeper? So you dig a layer below that, and then you see the main UI pattern. It's the MVVM pattern, which is similar to MVC if you've used that before. I'm like, okay, so I'm still not to the domain. You go a layer deeper, you get into the models, and after that, you start seeing the domain objects, propositions, arguments, worldview, those kind of things. So the domain is hidden, for one. And then it's also scattered. So these domain objects live in all these various projects. So they're kind of scattered throughout. So this was before the cleanse, so I'm like, all right, I kind of have a vision of what I want to do. Let me work at it. And this is how I like to think about myself while I'm coding, right? Working on the matrix, got 50 screens going on, looking cool, I know Kung Fu. But what happened was that by working on this app over the next 100 commits, I just tried to take it little by little, closer and closer to what I thought was more of a domain-oriented design. And so I'll kind of jump to the result, which was after it. I'm proud to say it's better. Probably not perfect. Probably ways to make this much better. But now when you open up the solution, the domain is front and center. So you open it up and you have logic analysis, the first thing you see. You see the engine, the terms, you see tutorials, you'll see argument, proposition, worldview. So the domain is front and center. These are the use cases, this is the business logic. This is what my app is about, right? And then hanging off to the side are the details. What UI am I using? HTML5, console, Windows. What messaging framework am I using? What persistence layer? What third-party tools am I using? So that's all hanging off to the side. And so one trick in an IDE I experimented with, I don't know if it's a great idea, but it sorts things alphabetically from A to Z, of course, right? And so I was like, how can I make the things that I don't want front and center to be at the end? And in some architectural patterns, they call those the non-domain objects ports and adapters. I'm like, okay, ports and adapters, that's P, that's kind of middle. What if it's the ports and adapters? That's near the end. That'll show up at the last of the list. I'm like, well, if I say it with a German accent, the ports and adapters, then it's at the very end. And I'm like, okay, I'll try that out. It'll at least work for now. So anywhere you see the ports and adapters is where I put all the non-domain stuff. So even inside domain objects like tutorials, sees the ports and adapters. So the kind of techie stuff is often those areas of the solution. So one thing that really helped this cleanse happen, and I'll talk about how I did the cleanse here in a little bit, but after experimenting with test-driven development, test automation, I'm a big believer now in fast, comprehensive test automation suite. Test-driven development is one great way to get there. We can talk about that more later. But what was really nice about having this is you can see I have thousands of tests here, fast tests that can run in, 1,000 of them or so can run in less than a second or a couple seconds. And so those tests, instantiate little parts of the app or little chunks of code or little objects here and there. And then it will pass in some inputs and check the outputs to make sure it's doing the right thing. And then the middle layer, the slow tests, these would maybe walk through a whole user scenario in an automated fashion without using the UI. So these slow tests and these fast tests, you're not clicking through the app or you're not talking to the database, or you might be in the middle layer in the slow test. But the slow test, it wasn't clicking through the app, but it would exercise a whole user scenario and make sure everything works and looks good. And at the top of the pyramid are the very slow tests. And these are useful, but you don't want that many of them because these are the ones that most people think of when they hear about test automation. These are the tools like Selenium or Protractor, the things that will click through the app and enter some text in the text box, click login and expect the right page to show up and things like that. So they're really useful for making sure everything is glued together really well and that the app overall works from a very high level perspective. But according to this philosophy with the test pyramid, you want to keep the top layer very small because those tests are really slow. I've worked on a project where we had thousands of these things and it would take days to run. And they're also very flaky. They pass sometimes, they fail sometimes because sometimes when it's running the GUI click test, all of a sudden the Windows updater will pop up in the middle of it and break the test. It's really fragile. But they're useful to have, but you don't want to have too many of them. So I was kind of following this philosophy of this project, and it made it really, really nice to take big risks in doing this cleanse, because I could be like, what if I move things around? And I could take big risks moving stuff around, and I could run my tests and make sure nothing broke. So that was a big enabler for this cleanse. So what was the refactoring I did to make the domain front and center? So the big one was the extract project refactoring. So if you're familiar with refactoring or craftsmanship at all in software engineering, it's similar to the extract class or extract module refactoring. So in that refactoring, you have a module or class, and let's say it does too much. It does the logic of the report and also does the formatting of the report, and it does 5 other things. So the extract class refactoring will say, hey, let's take out into one module the thing that does the logic, and one thing that into another module the thing that does the formatting, and keep those 2 things separate so we don't risk breaking one or the other when we change one. So this is kind of like a extract project refactoring is like a meta level above that. So in my biggest project, Software Logic WPF, where most of my behavior was, I had this ginormous project that had all the domain objects, all the tools, everything in there in one. What I do is I try to extract out pieces of it into their own little projects. So out of this big one, I extract the proposition project that had all the source code files related to propositions. Then I extract the argument one, and I also extract ones that were non-domain. I extract out messaging into its own project to keep it separate. And so basically I just rinse and repeat, just kept doing this again and again every time I was touching the code. And I pull things out into separate projects. And one roadblock I ran into quite a bit, at least at the beginning, was circular dependency. For those of you who are programmers, I don't know if you've ever seen this screen, but saying, sorry buddy, I can't compile this, this isn't gonna work. Because what was happening is I was pulling out, B from A. It kind of looked like this picture. B still dependent on A, and A still dependent on B, and you can't do that with code. It's a circular dependency. And so what was happening is this exposed a design flaw. So in this product I worked on, I really tried hard to have clean code and follow the solid principles to have things separated from each other. But doing this refactoring really exposed where I missed. Because what would happen is I try to be pulling out proposition away from the UI, and I would get it separate, but then it would get the circular dependency because the proposition objects knew a little bit about the UI tooling. Like there were parts of it that had knowledge of the UI tooling and depended upon it. And so I basically, if you imagine the proposition bucket as being that abstraction, it had leaks in it. It was leaking out and knowing about things in the other world. And so I basically had to fix those leaky abstractions and plug those holes and be like, okay, this UI piece is pulled out and put in another project where it belongs, and keep this proposition project pure and just about what its domain is. So after running this experiment, what were some of the pros and cons? And so one pro is it made my code even more plug and play. So following the solid principles and clean code practices makes your code plug and play. The example you see here is kind of driven from like a human experience where, if you buy a lamp, you don't buy the lamp, take it home, and then you get out your soldering and you wire it into the wall, right? You don't do that because you're probably going to change lamps. You're going to need to move it or plug it somewhere else. But often, kind of the way, at least the way I learned to write programming is we kind of hardwired everything to everything, you know what I mean? And so every time you change something, you were like ripping cords out of the wall, and it was really messy and risky. So the solid principles help with that, but then also doing this refactoring really made it even more plug and play, because I really had to clean up all those leaky abstractions and make everything nice plugs so things could plug in and out of each other. And it made it much easier to identify where things plug and can plug. One pro, as you kind of saw with the solution explorers, is easier to find the domain, right? So I'm adding a new feature to this product right now, and adding a new tutorial. And so what did I do? I just opened up the tutorial project. There was no needing to hunt and peck and find through all the different tech projects. Where does tutorial live? It was like, oh, you just go to the tutorial project. I added a test for a new kind of tutorial, and then off and away I'm up and running and working on the tutorial, and made it much easier to find where the meat of the software is at. One was a clear understanding and expression of dependencies. So while doing the refactoring, I thought I kind of knew what depended on what, but since it was all in one project, it was kind of all wadded up together and it wasn't quite clear. While having to extract everything out, I came to see what really depends on what. So in some places, it kind of exposed a nice dependency tree that I was intending, right? Like, oh, here's my domain objects, and then the layer above that depends upon those, and there's this nice hierarchy, yay! But then it also exposed dependencies that I'm kind of dragging around where, you know, some projects that shouldn't know about the messaging third-party tool I'm using knew about it, right? And so I made it really clear where I was lacking. But it kind of embedded that in the code instead of just being in my head. It was much more embedded and clear in the project layout when you open it up, what depends upon what. So that was another pro. Something that kind of led to a pro is I went from 6 projects to 60, which can be its own con we'll talk about later. But one con of having all these small light projects is it made the build and test really fast. So if I'm like working on a new feature right now in the tutorial project, I just have open the tutorial project and tutorial test. All the rest of the code, I don't even need to touch right now, you know what I mean? So when I build and run automated tests, it's lightning fast, because I'm only touching this one little part. Where before, you change one little thing, and since it's all in one project, it recompile everything and then rerun everything, and so that was slower in one sense. But another way, a con, is it did make me slower when I'm rebuilding and retesting everything. So at least the way it works in Visual Studio IDE is that if I'm done working on my thing and I want to go run all the tests, rebuild everything, and make sure the whole thing works, not just this little piece, you know, so I'll go get a cup of coffee or something. It took about 10 seconds longer than it used to rerun everything, because instead of having 6 projects to build, now it's 60 projects to rebuild. And so it's just more resource intensive to build all those projects. And so, let's see, another con was, it was significant work to do this experiment, this refactoring. At least if you don't start out with this kind of domain-oriented approach. So, you know, it kind of felt like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. I mean, it was a lot of tedious work to get it right. And there's things that can help you go faster while you're doing this, like an automated test suite. But at the end of the day, it was a significant amount of work. And so for me, the lesson learned was, man, it's, you know, so one thing I'll state out front is, it's really hard to recommend anything, right? Everyone's context is really different. All I can do is share from my own experiences. And so from my experience, I felt like this refactoring was worthwhile, this architectural cleanse. But one con of it was, man, it was a lot of rework. So for me, it was like, let me start out this way in whatever I work in, so I don't have to do all this rework later and experience the benefit without the pain of this rework. And being an infomercial, but wait, there's more. So I don't know if you guys have met Chris Lucian yet, but if you act now on the architectural cleanse, you can get a cheetah pet of him for only $19.95. So you should really capitalize on this opportunity. So that was my talk, and thank you very much for your time. And now we'll open it up for some discussion. Stop recording.